It was the morning of November the 8th in the year 1965 when the silence within a townhouse on East 67th Street in New York bore witness to a discovery that would linger in shadows for decades. There, in her bed, lay Dorothy Kilgallen, the sharp-tongued journalist, the fearless seeker of truths, now still, her lips sealed forever. A glass upon the table, a manuscript left unfinished, and a city that would never again hear her questions echo across its crowded streets. Before we begin, dear listener, I welcome you to pause and share with us in the comments when and where you are listening to this story. These words reach across time, and in your presence, they join the threads of a larger memory. If you find comfort in this telling, I invite you to subscribe so that together we may preserve the voices of those who came before us. Now let us step gently into the life of Dorothy Kilgallen, a woman whose pen carved light into dark places, yet who carried within her secrets that perhaps none of us will ever fully know. The story begins not with her end, but with her first breaths, drawn in the year 1913, when the city of New York was still young in its ambition, though already ancient in its restless hunger. The streets were lined with brick and iron, carriages mingled with motor cars, and the scent of coal smoke drifted above the East River. It was in this city of clamor that Dorothy May Kilgallen entered the world, the daughter of a newspaperman, born into an inheritance of ink, words, and the ceaseless search for stories. Her father, James Kilgallen, was a reporter of some renown, a man whose typewriter rang out like a bell in the crowded halls of newsrooms. Dorothy grew in his shadow, watching the way he listened, the way he questioned, the way his eyes narrowed whenever truth tried to hide itself behind polite phrases. For a child, the music of keys striking paper was not the sound of labor, but the song of destiny. Imagine her small fingers tracing the raised letters of a typewriter, pressing without strength, yet learning the pattern of letters, the hidden power they carried. Outside, trolley bells clanged, vendors cried out their wares, and the Hudson swelled with ships carrying stories from other lands. But inside the Kilgallen household, there was a quieter rhythm. The steady tap of her father's hands upon the machine, the smell of paper, the faint tang of ink, the late nights when lamps burned long after other families had gone to rest. Dorothy's childhood was filled not with toys of leisure, but with the presence of words. She read eagerly, as if each page contained a secret meant only for her. Her mother, May, cared for the home, but it was her father's craft that drew Dorothy most of all. She learned early that a story was not just entertainment. A story could wound, could heal, could stir a city to anger or calm it into sleep. And so, though she was but a girl, her mind absorbed the lesson that the written word was sharper than any blade, and in the right hands, it could cut through silence itself. Yet what does it mean for a child to grow beneath the gaze of such purpose? Did Dorothy feel herself chosen, or did she feel herself bound? The answers are hidden in the soft folds of her earliest years. Those who knew her later would speak of her brilliance, her wit, her sharp humor, as if these had sprung from the earth fully formed. But every wit is forged in the fire of listening. Every sharp tongue is sharpened first by silence. One imagines her sitting quietly, observing, while adults spoke too freely in her presence, believing that the girl would not remember. But Dorothy remembered. The city was her school as much as any classroom. The subway's rush taught her the pace of modern life. The laughter and shouting from Broadway carried to her ears the rhythms of performance, of presentation, of image. And in her father's world, she learned that beneath every polished face lay another, hidden, waiting to be uncovered. New York in those years was a place of both hope and despair, a city swelling with immigrants, with those who sought new lives and those who clung to old traditions. Dorothy's family was of Irish descent, their roots intertwined with the struggles and pride of a people who had known hardship. It was in such soil that Dorothy's restlessness was planted. She attended parochial school, where discipline was strict and rules were sharp as rulers across the knuckles. There, perhaps, she learned the value of defiance, the inner spark that later made her fearless when others were silent. She was bright, restless, eager to be seen not only as her father's daughter, but as her own voice, and already whispers of ambition stirred within her. The world of journalism in those days was not meant for women to command. A woman could write a household column, a review of fashion, perhaps a gentle commentary on society. But to question officials, to chase crime, to probe corruption, these belonged to men with hats pulled low and cigarettes between their lips. Dorothy, though, was watching. She saw the way her father was treated, the way doors opened for a man with questions and a notebook. And perhaps she thought to herself, why not me? Why must I not also step across that threshold? Even as a girl, Dorothy displayed the traits that would define her: the quick retort, the piercing eye, the unwillingness to be dismissed. At gatherings, she would speak boldly, sometimes shocking those who expected silence. Teachers noted her cleverness, though at times her independence drew rebuke. It is said that destiny often announces itself quietly, but in Dorothy it declared itself early, refusing to be hidden. Her father's colleagues sometimes visited the home, bringing with them the smell of newsprint, the weary excitement of men who lived half in the world of fact and half in the haze of deadline. They would exchange tales of City Hall, of crime, of whispered scandals. And Dorothy listened, each tale sinking into her like a seed awaiting its season. What does it do to a young mind to hear of power's corruption, to hear of secrets, betrayals, lives broken by a single headline? It gives that mind a sense of the fragility of appearances, and perhaps it instills a hunger to see past the mask of ordinary life. One might imagine her in those evenings, her ear pressed to the polished wood of the table, or her eyes half closed, pretending sleep as men spoke in the next room. These impressions, half dreamed, would later surface in her work, her sentences carrying the edge of suspicion, the refusal to accept a simple story when a deeper one was waiting. By the time Dorothy entered her teenage years, the city itself was changing. The Great War had ended, and America was stepping into an age of confidence, an age where radios began to hum in every parlor, where jazz carried on the night air, and where women themselves were beginning to claim a louder voice. Dorothy was just a child when women won the right to vote, but she grew up in the knowledge that the world could change, that barriers could fall, that silence could be broken. This awareness was as much a part of her education as the lessons of any classroom. In these early years, we see the formation of a journalist not through assignments, but through impressions. A girl who watched more than she spoke, who listened with more hunger than others guessed, who learned that words could be both shield and sword. This was the Dorothy who would one day challenge politicians, expose the secrets of celebrities, and dare to question the story of a president's death. But for now, she was still only a girl, leaning close to the typewriter of her father, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingertips, hearing the steady rhythm of keys striking paper. That sound, more than any lullaby, carried her into the future. The night grows quiet and the sound of that typewriter lingers, each click an unanswered question, each pause a silence waiting to be broken. And in that silence, the story of Dorothy Kilgallen's life was already being written, though neither she nor the world could yet read its final line. The sound of the typewriter keys echoes still, each stroke ringing out in memory, and from that rhythm, Dorothy's first steps into journalism would be taken. It was as though the machine itself called her forward, promising that if she learned to command it, doors would open and stories would come alive beneath her hands. She began her path in the shadow of her father's trade, for James Kilgallen's world was one of deadlines, courthouse steps, and the restless shuffle of reporters vying for a sentence worth printing. Yet Dorothy was not content merely to listen. She wished to join the music of that world, to place her own words upon the page. Her earliest attempts came as practice, short pieces written with determination but without the polish time would bring. The newsroom in those days was no gentle place for a young woman. It smelled of ink and sweat, smoke curling from ashtrays beside ringing telephones, voices raised in urgency, typewriters clattering without pause. Men in shirt sleeves leaned against walls, argued over headlines, and dashed down staircases toward city streets where events unfolded. Into this din, Dorothy stepped, carrying with her not timidity, but a spark of defiance. Her father guided her, though never indulgently. He knew the craft was demanding, the editors harsher still, and he offered no illusions. He reminded her that every sentence must earn its place, that one could not merely fill space with words, but must seize the reader's eye and hold it. Dorothy absorbed these lessons, sharpening her instincts, yet at the same time, she began to feel the tension of inheritance. Was she merely following the path her father had cut, or was she carving her own? The question lingered, as it does for every child who bears a family's profession within their blood. Her first notable assignment came when she entered a newspaper contest, a chance for young hopefuls to prove themselves. Dorothy, then still in her teens, took part with a determination that surprised even those who knew her. The task was to write of the city itself, to capture New York not as a map, but as a living presence. Dorothy walked its streets with notebook in hand, the smells of roasting chestnuts mixing with the iron tang of the subway, the voices of vendors rising and fading as she passed. She wrote with precision, capturing not merely what was seen, but the pulse beneath it. When her submission was praised, she felt the first true affirmation that her pen might carry her beyond her father's shadow. In time, she found herself reporting small items, the kinds of stories that filled columns between larger headlines. Yet even here, she revealed a gift. She wrote of ordinary things with a sharpness that lifted them beyond routine. A society gathering described by Dorothy did not merely list names but hinted at undercurrents, the way a laugh lingered too long, or how a glance suggested envy behind courtesy. She had already learned that stories lived not in what was said, but in what trembled unspoken beneath the words. Still, it was not easy. In the early 1930s, when Dorothy began to press forward, few editors believed women could handle the rougher edges of reporting. She was often offered assignments meant to be light, gentle, or decorative, but she resisted, insisting that her mind was no less suited to hard questions than that of any man. Some sneered, some dismissed her, yet slowly she won ground. With each column, her wit became apparent, and soon her name began to carry weight in the pages of the city's newspapers. But what did it feel like for Dorothy, so young, to step into this world of smoke and steel? Imagine her late at night, returning home after hours spent at her desk. The city's lights reflected in puddles along the pavement, the air carrying the mingled scent of rain and gasoline. Her hands perhaps still smudged with ink, her mind replaying the cadence of sentences she had shaped. Did she feel satisfaction, or did she feel only the restless hunger for the next story? It is in such moments, unrecorded by history, that we catch a glimpse of the private soul behind the public pen. Her father watched with pride, but also caution. He knew the path ahead would test her. Journalism was not merely about words, it was about endurance, about withstanding the pressures of powerful men who would prefer silence, about carrying knowledge that could isolate as much as it could illuminate. Dorothy, still in the bloom of youth, carried within her a resilience that few suspected. By the mid-1930s, she had secured a place in the newsroom of the New York Evening Journal, where she began to develop her voice in earnest. Here she faced deadlines that loomed like storm clouds, editors who barked without mercy, and colleagues who doubted she would last. But Dorothy did last. Her columns began to gain attention, and her name no longer appeared as an apprentice, but as a voice worth reading. It was in these early years that she discovered the blend of observation and reflection that would define her career. She did not merely record events, she questioned them. She looked at the theater world, at the society pages, at the everyday spectacles of city life, and she asked what they revealed about the people who lived them. Her style was sharp yet never cruel, witty yet carrying the weight of seriousness beneath the surface. She had learned to balance the entertaining with the insightful, the surface sparkle with the depth of inquiry. Some nights after the presses had rolled and the last paper boys had carried her words into the streets, Dorothy would sit quietly, the hum of the city in her ears. She must have wondered what it meant to be heard by thousands, to send her thoughts into homes she would never enter. Did the power of that reach thrill her, or did it humble her with its responsibility? The answer may have been both, for in Dorothy's career we see a woman both exhilarated by her influence and haunted by its weight. Her earliest notoriety came not from scandals or politics, but from her gift for capturing the atmosphere of the city's stage and society. Yet already, beneath her elegant phrasing, there was a restlessness, a refusal to accept appearances as truth. In her words, one can feel the stirring of a deeper curiosity, the same curiosity that, years later, would lead her into dangerous investigations. But at this time, she was still learning the ropes, still finding her balance between admiration and doubt, still proving herself in a world not eager to grant her equality. The presses rolled again, and the sound of their machinery filled the night. Ink spread across white pages, names and stories carried into the dark city. Dorothy had taken her first steps, small yet decisive, into the world her father had shown her. She was no longer merely the daughter of James Kilgallen. She was becoming Dorothy Kilgallen, a voice in her own right, a voice that would not easily be silenced. And as the presses thundered, the noise faded into the distance, leaving only the echo of a question. What stories lay ahead for the young reporter, and how far would her pen carry her into the mysteries of the world? The thunder of the presses fades into the quiet of dawn, the ink still damp upon pages folded and carried into the hands of strangers. It is in this hush that Dorothy's voice began to carry beyond the limits of the newsroom, beyond the reach of her father's guidance, into the larger arena of the American imagination. For though she had proven herself capable among the journalists of New York, her true ascent came with the birth of her column, Voice of Broadway, a name that captured both the glamour of the city's stages and the whispers of its unseen corridors. It began as a modest effort, an attempt to blend theater commentary with glimpses of the city's glittering life. Yet under Dorothy's hand, it quickly became something more. She was not content merely to describe gowns, performances, or soirees. She had an instinct for revealing the interplay of power and vanity, for noticing when laughter seemed forced or when an actor's charm hid disquiet. In this way, her column drew readers who sought more than simple society notes. They sought Dorothy's voice, that sharp yet elegant tone which seemed to know more than it said, and which hinted at truths too delicate to be spoken outright. Imagine the city in those years, the late 1930s into the 40s, when Broadway shone with neon lights and nightclubs pulsed with jazz. The war abroad cast its shadow, yet within the city the show went on, and people sought diversion in laughter, music, and spectacle. Dorothy wandered these streets, not as a mere spectator, but as a collector of fragments, each conversation, each overheard aside, stored within her memory. Later, at her desk, she would turn them into sentences that captured not only the event, but the hidden currents beneath it. She wrote of performers and politicians alike, of singers whose notes carried more than melody, of men whose influence stretched farther than their smiles revealed. Readers turned to her column as if turning to a trusted confidant. And in this trust, Dorothy discovered her power. For words, when carried across syndication, no longer belonged to the city alone. They traveled to towns and states far beyond, carried in newspapers that arrived with the Morning Post, read by housewives, businessmen, and young dreamers alike. In each of them, Dorothy's voice became familiar, like a neighbor whose window always offered a view into the hidden world. But what is fame to one who values truth above comfort? For Dorothy, recognition was both blessing and burden. She enjoyed the sparkle of being known, the invitations to clubs and theaters, the company of stars who saw in her an ally as well as a chronicler. Yet she also felt the edge of expectation, the knowledge that each column must cut, must intrigue, must offer something that others did not know. To sustain such a pace is to live in constant search, and Dorothy lived in that search as though it were her lifeblood. Her style was unlike others. Where some gossiped with cruelty, she wrote with precision. Where others flattered, she questioned. Even her wit, which delighted audiences, carried within it a sharpness that reminded readers she was not to be trifled with. Celebrities who spoke with her often found themselves both charmed and unsettled, for she had a way of listening that pierced through pretense. Was this a gift inherited from her father, or something uniquely hers? Perhaps it was both, sharpened by her restless curiosity. The column grew until it was read across the nation. Imagine a small-town reader in the Midwest opening the paper to Dorothy's words, catching a glimpse of Broadway lights, of whispered secrets, of the glamour and intrigue of New York. For them, Dorothy was a guide into another world, a world at once distant and immediate, filled with the same human flaws and desires that filled their own lives. She connected the provincial with the cosmopolitan, the ordinary with the extraordinary. In doing so, she became not only a reporter, but a bridge. Yet the bridge carried its dangers. To reveal too much of the powerful was to invite their displeasure. Dorothy understood this and danced upon the line with skill. She gave enough to intrigue, enough to hint, but often left space for readers to wonder. In that space lay her mastery, for it is not always the revealed secret that holds power, but the suggestion of what may lie beyond. Her readers leaned closer, listening between the lines, and in doing so, Dorothy commanded their imagination. By the 1940s, Dorothy Kilgallen was no longer merely a journalist of New York. She was a national voice, her name known, her face soon to be recognized, her wit celebrated. Yet within her lay a duality that would follow her throughout life. On one side, the glamour, the invitations, the praise. On the other, the relentless drive, the hunger for the next discovery, the unwillingness to rest upon what had already been achieved. It is in this duality that we see the seeds of both her greatness and her undoing. Her evenings were often spent in clubs and theaters, moving among actors, singers, politicians, each moment another chance to gather whispers. She smiled, laughed, raised a glass, yet always observed. The clinking of champagne glasses around her masked the quiet turning of her thoughts. Each overheard confession, each slip of the tongue, became another thread in the tapestry she wove for her readers. It was said she had the memory of a ledger, each name and detail inscribed indelibly. This gift served her well, but it also meant she carried within her a weight that others could not see. When the presses once more rolled with her words, Dorothy's presence was felt across the land. The laughter of nightclubs, the applause of theaters, the murmurs of secret liaisons, all were carried in her sentences. And yet, as her fame grew, so too did the quiet envy of those who wondered how a woman could command such attention. Some whispered that she was too bold, too sharp, too unwilling to soften her pen. But Dorothy would not soften. She had chosen her path, and each column was another step upon it. As the years passed, Voice of Broadway became more than a title. It became a symbol of Dorothy herself, the woman who dared to speak what others only hinted, who combined glamour with inquiry, who refused to remain in the shadows of any man. She had stepped fully into her own voice, and the nation listened. The night deepens, and the echoes of her laughter mingle with the fading strains of jazz drifting from a Broadway club. Yet beneath the laughter, one hears another sound, softer, insistent. The scratching of a pen across paper, the restless pursuit of the next story. And in that sound, Dorothy's journey continues, leading her from the neon glow of Broadway toward the invisible waves of radio, where her voice would soon travel farther still. The scratching of her pen fades into silence, replaced by another sound, softer yet more powerful in its reach, the hum of a microphone warming to life, the faint static of airwaves waiting to carry a voice. Dorothy, who had conquered the page and the stage-lit whispers of Broadway, now stepped into a new realm, the unseen world of radio. Here, her presence was no longer bound to print or to the eyes of her readers. It became something more intimate, more immediate, for her voice could travel into homes and settle into the ears of strangers as though she were speaking only to them. Radio in the 1930s and 40s was more than a medium. It was a companion. Families gathered around their sets as one might gather around a hearth, listening to news, to drama, to music, and to the voices of those they came to trust. Dorothy's entry into this world was both natural and daring. She had the wit, the cadence, the quickness of thought that radio required, but she also carried something rare, the ability to sound as though she revealed confidences, as though she let listeners into a secret place where truth and rumor mingled. Her early broadcasts were filled with the energy of a woman eager to extend her reach. The same sharpness that cut through her columns now found rhythm in her speech. Her sentences, once pressed in ink, now floated on air, alive with nuance. Those who tuned in heard not only facts, but the weight Dorothy placed upon each word, the way her voice lifted when she questioned, the subtle pause that invited doubt. A pause on paper might be overlooked. A pause on radio became an opening, a small abyss into which listeners poured their own suspicions. Imagine the living rooms into which she spoke, lamps casting yellow pools of light, children hushed, the faint crackle of the set as her voice emerged. To some, she was the charming guide through society's glitter. To others, she was the bold questioner who unsettled comfort with insinuation. Either way, she became familiar, a presence threaded into daily routine. And with familiarity came influence, the kind that printed words alone could never fully achieve. Yet radio also tested her in new ways. In print, a misstep could be edited, a phrase adjusted. On air, her words were carried instantly, without the grace of revision. Dorothy mastered this challenge, sharpening her instincts further, learning when to strike with wit and when to let silence speak for her. She developed the rare skill of seeming spontaneous, yet always purposeful, her mind moving with quick precision while her tone remained warm, almost playful. The war years deepened the weight of her role. As the 1940s advanced and the world was drawn into conflict, radio became a lifeline of information. Though Dorothy was not a war correspondent, her voice carried a sense of connection, a reminder of the world beyond headlines and battles. She spoke of entertainment, of politics, of the shifting currents of culture, weaving together the fabric of a society under strain. Listeners leaned closer, finding in her words a measure of continuity amid uncertainty. But what does it mean to be a voice without a face, to exist in the imagination of millions as something unseen? For Dorothy, accustomed to the visible sparkle of Broadway, this must have been both strange and liberating. She could reach more people than ever before, yet she did so without adornment, without the gown, without the painted smile. Only her voice mattered, and in that realization, perhaps she discovered a new dimension of her craft. To communicate truth and curiosity without disguise, to strip herself down to tone and rhythm alone. This was a test of her essence as a journalist. She passed that test, and in doing so, prepared herself for what would follow. For radio was not the end, but a passage, a doorway into the still newer realm of television that awaited her. Yet before she stepped through, she built upon the intimacy radio had offered, the bond with listeners who came to feel that Dorothy belonged not only to New York, but to them, wherever they lived. It was in this bond that her power deepened. For influence lies not merely in being read or heard, but in being trusted. And still, beneath the surface of her wit and presence, there lingered the same restlessness. Dorothy was never satisfied to remain within boundaries. Each new medium she entered, she mastered, yet she always looked beyond it, asking what lay hidden, what secrets might be uncovered if she pushed further. This restlessness was not always visible to her audience, but it burned within her, the silent engine of her career. Consider the irony. While she became a familiar voice in homes across the nation, in her own life she remained somewhat apart, a figure of both presence and solitude. The voice that comforted thousands returned each evening to its own quiet, to its own unanswered questions. Perhaps that solitude sharpened her, teaching her to listen more deeply, to sense the unspoken, even in silence. Her colleagues in radio often spoke of her quick wit, of her ability to turn a phrase in the moment. They admired her courage, though some bristled at her refusal to yield to convention. She did not soften her questions merely to please. She pressed, sometimes too far for comfort. But that was Dorothy's gift, the willingness to tread where others hesitated, to risk disapproval in pursuit of clarity. The war ended, the world shifted again, and radio began to yield ground to the new magic of television. Yet Dorothy's voice did not fade. Instead, it prepared itself for the next stage, the moment when her presence would become not only heard, but seen, when her eyes and her wit together would captivate the nation. The microphone, warm with her voice, dimmed at last, but its echoes carried forward, guiding her into the light of a new stage. And as the static faded into silence, there remained the image of Dorothy seated before the microphone, her notes spread out like cards upon the table, her gaze steady, her voice unshaken. That silence now opens into the sound of applause, the shifting of an audience awaiting entertainment, and the stage lights brightening. For Dorothy was about to step into the glow of television, where her questions would be asked not only in words, but in the arch of an eyebrow, the curl of a smile, the tilt of her head. The applause swells in the mind's ear, carrying us from the dim studio of radio to the bright stage of a new invention, television, where pictures and voices joined together and the nation found itself gazing into glowing screens. It was here that Dorothy Kilgallen's presence expanded, not only as a voice but as a figure, a face that millions would come to know. The program was What's My Line, a show of civility and wit, where panelists sought to unravel the identities and occupations of guests through questions both sharp and playful. And among those panelists, Dorothy's figure soon stood out like a jewel upon velvet, her eyes bright, her laughter quick, her questions edged with subtle daring. To understand the impact of this, we must recall what television was in the early 1950s. It was still a miracle, its flickering images a marvel to households newly gathered around their sets. Families that once huddled by radios now sat before glowing screens, their evenings reshaped by the presence of moving pictures. Into this landscape Dorothy stepped, already known for her columns and her radio voice, but now clothed in the elegance of evening gowns, her hair styled with meticulous care, her wit sharpened for the game at hand. She was not an actress, nor a singer, but she carried herself with the poise of one who belonged before the public eye. On What's My Line? She sat among men of stature and humor, yet she was never overshadowed. Her questions came with precision, delivered with a rhythm that betrayed both intelligence and instinct. Sometimes her inquiries were playful, coaxing laughter from the audience. Other times they carried an edge, a suggestion that she could pierce through pretense with ease. The guests, whether celebrities or ordinary workers with unusual trades, often looked at her with a mixture of amusement and caution, as though aware that she might see more than they wished revealed. It was this balance, charm wrapped around insight, that made Dorothy unforgettable. For while the show was a game, watched for amusement, she brought to it the same curiosity that defined her journalism. Beneath the sparkle of her gowns and the elegance of her posture lay the same relentless questioner, unwilling to accept easy answers, always probing just a little deeper. And viewers loved her for it. They loved that she was not content with surface play, but sought the truth hidden beneath. Night after night, as the show aired, her presence grew. People spoke of her at dinner tables, imitated her wit, admired her style. She became not only a journalist, but a celebrity. Her name carried into homes where once she had been only a byline. Fame, which had been growing steadily, now flowered fully. Dorothy Kilgallen was no longer only the daughter of a newspaperman, no longer only the voice of Broadway or the unseen companion on radio waves. She was a star in her own right, her image woven into the fabric of American evenings. But what does it mean to live a life so divided? By day, she was the sharp columnist, chasing stories, probing politics, asking questions that unsettled the comfortable. By night, she was the glamorous panelist, her laughter mingling with applause, her elegance masking the toil of deadlines and investigations. Perhaps she enjoyed the duality, the way one role lightened the weight of the other. Or perhaps, as with many who carry more than one mask, she felt the strain of holding them all at once. There was something else in her performance on What's My Line? A sense of composure, of steadiness, that masked deeper currents. Viewers saw the polished figure, the poised speaker, the witty questioner. They did not see the woman who returned home weary, who wrestled with private doubts, who felt the burden of always being on. And so the nation loved her image, while only a few glimpsed the hidden cost of sustaining it. Her colleagues on the panel respected her, though some were wary of her sharpness. She had a way of stealing a moment, of guiding the rhythm of the show with a glance or a well-placed question. John Charles Daly, the dignified host, often smiled in quiet recognition of her influence. Other panelists, whether Bennett Cerf with his dry wit or Arlene Francis with her warmth, knew that Dorothy's presence was essential, that without her, the balance of the panel would shift. Together they created a harmony, but Dorothy's note was always distinct, the one that lingered after the laughter faded. Her wardrobe, her style, became a subject of admiration. Women studied her gowns, her hair, her jewelry, as though in them lay the secret of her poise. Men admired her wit, sometimes underestimating the depth of her mind, forgetting that behind the sparkle was a seasoned journalist who could cut through evasions in her daily work. Dorothy let them underestimate if they wished, for she knew that underestimation was itself a form of power. Yet within her, the journalist never slept. Even as she smiled on stage, she was aware of the world beyond the studio, of stories unfolding in Washington, of whispers in nightclubs, of scandals that waited to be revealed. She balanced the trivial and the serious, the game and the investigation, carrying both without letting them collapse into each other. But in that balance lay an invisible tension, a tension that grew heavier with each passing year. One can imagine her leaving the studio after a taping, the applause still echoing faintly in her ears, her gown wrapped in a protective bag, her face washed clean of makeup. Outside, the city streets awaited her, with their noise, their secrets, their restless energy. The glamour of television slipped away, and she returned to notebooks, to interviews, to the ceaseless pursuit of stories. This was her rhythm, one life layered upon another, each demanding, each refusing to yield. In the quiet of those evenings, did she wonder which life was more real? Was she the polished panelist, adored by millions for her laughter and wit? Or was she the relentless journalist, scribbling in dim light, searching for answers others preferred to leave untouched? Perhaps she was both, and perhaps that duality was her strength. Yet perhaps it was also the weight that would one day press her down, for no one can wear two masks forever without cost. Still, in those years, her star shone brightly. The applause, the laughter, the admiration, they were hers, and they gave her a place in American memory that would endure long after her voice was silenced. For many who watched her, Dorothy Kilgallen was not merely a journalist or a celebrity. She was a symbol of intelligence paired with grace, of courage hidden behind a smile, of a woman who would not be confined to the roles others tried to assign. And so the applause lingers, softening now as the studio lights dim. The game is over for the evening, the panelists rise from their chairs, and the audience disperses into the night. Yet the questions Dorothy carried remained with her, questions not of occupations or riddles, but of life itself, of truth hidden behind appearances. And as the last echo of laughter fades, we find ourselves drawn into the next chamber of her life, the one that lay beyond the studio doors, where family and private struggles waited in shadows. The last echo of applause fades, and the bright studio lights dim into darkness, leaving Dorothy to step beyond the stage into a world less forgiving, the private realm where no audience clapped and no laughter softened the edges of disappointment. It is here, behind the curtain of fame, that we glimpse Dorothy Kilgallen as wife and mother, as a woman caught between the demands of a glittering career and the quieter, yet equally complex bonds of home. For even the brightest stars must return each evening to rooms where applause cannot be heard, where the questions asked are not of strangers' occupations, but of loyalty, affection, and the fragile ties that hold a family together. In 1940, Dorothy married Richard Colmer, an actor and Broadway producer whose charm had drawn her into his orbit. To the public, theirs seemed a union of equals, a pairing of two figures who each commanded presence in the cultural life of New York. Dorothy, with her wit and sharpness, and Richard, with his stagecraft and ambition, appeared to embody the glamour of a couple attuned to both artistry and fame. Together they hosted gatherings, shared laughter in company, and were seen as a household glittering with possibility. Yet beneath appearances, the union bore strains that deepened with time. Richard, though talented, struggled to secure the steady triumphs that Dorothy seemed to command so effortlessly. Her column reached millions. Her presence on radio and television gave her a standing that few journalists of any gender could equal. For a man accustomed to being noticed, to shaping productions upon the stage, the shadow cast by his wife's success could not have been easy to bear. Dorothy's victories, though shared publicly, may have landed privately as comparisons, each headline for her a reminder for him of what he had not achieved. The home they built together was filled with children and with the outward trappings of comfort. Dorothy took pride in her children, and for all her professional drive, she was attentive to them, striving to balance the dual worlds of public figure and private mother. One can imagine her returning late from a taping, still carrying the aura of stage lights and bending to kiss her children goodnight, the fragrance of powder and perfume lingering in the darkened rooms. In such moments, perhaps, she felt the tug of both lives, the impossibility of giving all of herself to either. Richard, meanwhile, drifted into shadows of his own. His ventures in radio and theater did not always bring the success he desired, and whispers of infidelity began to circulate. Dorothy, who had built her life on uncovering the hidden truths of others, could hardly be blind to the evasions within her own household, yet she did not sever the bond. She carried it, as many women of her era did, with patience mingled with sorrow, holding together the fabric of a family even as threads pulled loose beneath her fingers. To the outside world they remained the Kilgallen Colmars, a couple of distinction, their townhouse a place of receptions, their names often appearing in print together. But within those walls, the air sometimes grew heavy with unspoken discontent. Dorothy's hours were long, her mind perpetually turning towards stories, interviews, columns. Richard sought solace elsewhere, and in this seeking the rift widened. Still, they shared children, memories, and a mutual need for the appearance of unity. Appearances mattered, especially in their world, and both understood the power of maintaining them. For Dorothy, the strain of private life was yet another burden she carried silently, rarely revealing to the public the weariness that came from managing both fame and fragility at once. She was a woman accustomed to shouldering responsibility, and so she did not falter outwardly. But within her, the toll mounted. Those who saw only the polished panelist on What's My Line or the confident columnist in print could not have guessed at the loneliness she sometimes felt at home. The glamour that so many envied was, in truth, braided with moments of disappointment and solitude. And yet, perhaps, it was this very solitude that sharpened her pen further. A woman who has known disillusionment at home may become even more skilled at detecting the cracks in the facades of others. Dorothy's sharp questions, her refusal to accept easy answers, may have drawn strength from her own awareness that truth, however uncomfortable, must eventually be faced. She had learned, in her own life, that appearances could be deceiving, that words spoken in company could hide betrayals unspoken. Thus her journalism carried not only curiosity, but a personal understanding of the fragility of trust. Still, we must not paint her household as only sorrow. There were nights of genuine warmth, evenings when the children's laughter filled the townhouse, when Richard's charm resurfaced, when Dorothy herself, setting aside the burdens of deadlines, found comfort in the simple rhythms of family life. Life is never only one thing, and Dorothy's was a tapestry woven of both brightness and shadow, joy and regret. To those who visited, the home seemed lively, the conversations quick, the spirit vibrant. But even within the liveliest rooms, Dorothy sometimes felt apart, as though a part of her always lingered with the next story waiting to be written. She was a woman pulled in many directions, a pioneer in a world not yet accustomed to women commanding such influence, and a wife in a marriage where the balance of success and failure tilted uneasily. This tension, invisible to those who saw only the surface, shaped her in ways that would prepare her for the greater battles ahead. For to endure in silence at home while shining in public requires resilience that few possess. Dorothy possessed it, though at a cost not easily measured. As the years passed, her marriage did not collapse in scandal but endured in quiet weariness, each partner fulfilling roles expected of them, though with less joy than in the beginning. Dorothy continued to work with relentless energy, channeling into her career the passions and frustrations that might otherwise have overwhelmed her. And so, while her private life drifted into shadow, her public life grew ever brighter, until the contrast itself became a kind of secret, a hidden story she herself carried silently. The creak of a door left half open at night lingers in the mind, an image of that household where shadows fell across the threshold and whispers carried in the silence. It is through that door we now step, leaving behind the fragility of her private bonds and moving once more into the sphere of her work, where her relentless pursuit of stories led her deeper into the culture of celebrity reporting, and where the line between friendship and inquiry would test her judgment and sharpen her instincts still further. The door left half open at night leads us onward, its shadowed frame opening not into the rooms of domestic strain, but into the glittering chambers of society, where Dorothy moved with both ease and calculation. Here was the realm of celebrity, of champagne glasses raised beneath chandeliers, of whispered secrets exchanged over the hum of orchestras. It was within this world that Dorothy sharpened her craft further, learning to balance charm with scrutiny, intimacy with exposure. For she was not merely a guest at the parties she attended, she was also their chronicler, the eye that missed nothing, the pen that transformed laughter and whispers into sentences that reached across the nation. The culture of celebrity reporting in those mid-century years was a curious dance. Stars were adored, yet fragile, admired, yet wary, desperate to be seen, yet fearful of being known too well. The journalist who covered them had to tread carefully, giving readers the sparkle they desired without severing the delicate threads of access. Many columnists softened their words, flattering their subjects in exchange for steady companionship, but Dorothy was of another spirit. She sought closeness, yes, but not at the price of honesty. Her columns often blended affection with inquiry, praise with a subtle questioning that suggested there was always more beneath the surface. She moved through nightclubs where music wrapped around the patrons like smoke, through hotel lobbies where power lingered in the stillness after midnight, through dressing rooms where actors removed not only their costumes, but their defenses. She listened. She remembered. And then, in the quiet of her study, she shaped these fragments into columns that sparkled on the page, yet carried an undercurrent of unease. For Dorothy never forgot that fame was fragile, that glamour was a mask, that behind the painted smile of a star might lie loneliness, despair, or scandal. Her readers loved her for this. They turned to her columns not merely for names and places, but for the feeling that she offered them entry into a hidden chamber of truth. Through her, they glimpsed the contradictions of the famous, their grandeur and their weakness, their triumphs and their stumbles. Dorothy offered not gossip, but something more enduring, an understanding that the powerful and the celebrated were no less human and no less vulnerable to folly. Yet in this work, she courted risk. Friendships could sour when words cut too deeply. Invitations could vanish if her pen grew too sharp. Dorothy knew this, and she balanced her words carefully, often hinting rather than declaring, leaving space for readers to draw their own conclusions. This technique made her columns all the more compelling, for suggestion carries a weight that blunt exposure often lacks. A rumor left unfinished, a detail half revealed, these stir the imagination far more than a story spelled out completely. Dorothy understood this instinctively, and it became one of her greatest strengths. She cultivated sources with skill, becoming both confidant and questioner. Stars trusted her, sometimes forgetting that trust is fragile when offered to one whose livelihood depends upon revelation. She received letters, phone calls, whispers in corridors, each fragment adding to her collection. Some sources sought her favor, eager to see their names in print. Others spoke out of desperation, hoping she might shape public opinion in their favor. Dorothy listened to all, weighed their words, and then chose carefully what to reveal. It was a power few women of her time wielded so openly, and it earned her admiration and resentment alike. But what of Dorothy herself, moving through this world of glamour and masks? Did she ever feel that she, too, wore a mask, that the poised woman in her gowns was a creation as carefully crafted as the stars she described? Perhaps she did, for no one can spend a lifetime observing others without reflecting upon their own performance. She must have known that she, too, was both subject and storyteller, both participant and observer. And perhaps this awareness lent her writing its unique mixture of intimacy and distance, as though she stood both inside and outside the scene at once. Her husband Richard sometimes accompanied her to these gatherings, though his presence was often overshadowed by Dorothy's radiance. He mingled, he smiled, he drank, but it was Dorothy who commanded attention. Dorothy whose sharp comments were remembered, Dorothy whose presence could alter the atmosphere of a room. This dynamic, repeated over years, deepened the strain between them, yet it also confirmed Dorothy's place as one of the most formidable women of her time. Celebrities often remarked upon her ability to ask the question no one else dared. In interviews, she pressed where others retreated, her eyes narrowing slightly, her smile remaining, but her words striking with precision. Some yielded to her questioning, offering confessions they later regretted. Others parried, attempting to deflect, only to find her returning again, relentless. It was this persistence that made her feared even as she was admired. For Dorothy was not content with surface brilliance. She wanted what lay beneath, and she had the patience to wait until it revealed itself. Her role as celebrity chronicler became, in a sense, training for the greater battles that lay ahead. In navigating the delicate balance between friendship and revelation, between admiration and critique, she honed the very skills she would later apply to far more dangerous subjects. To expose the cracks in a star's public image required courage, But to question the official narrative of national tragedy would demand far more. Without realizing it, perhaps, Dorothy was preparing herself in these years, building the strength, the methods, and the confidence that would one day propel her into the storm of controversy surrounding the death of a president. Yet even as she sharpened her craft, she lived with the cost of it. For to know the secrets of others is to carry a weight. Each whispered confession, each revelation of betrayal or despair, lodged within her memory, adding to the burden she bore. Dorothy was admired as glamorous, witty, fearless. Few saw the heaviness she carried, the loneliness that sometimes pressed upon her when the parties ended, when the laughter faded, when the house grew quiet, and she was left alone with her thoughts. The whispered rumor drifts away unfinished, like smoke dissolving into night air, leaving behind only the awareness that secrets always remain, some half-revealed, some concealed forever. It is in this unfinished whisper that we now pause, for it leads us into the next chamber of Dorothy's journey, the shifting of her gaze from the stage of Broadway and the world of celebrity toward the corridors of politics and power, where charm gave way to gravity, and where her pen began to draw closer to matters of national destiny. The unfinished whisper drifts through the night, and as it dissolves, Dorothy's gaze turns away from the stage lights of Broadway and the sparkling masks of celebrity toward corridors more shadowed, where decisions shaped the fate of nations and whispers carried consequences heavier than scandal. For as the 1950s waned and the 60s dawned, America itself entered a new season, its air charged with both optimism and unease. The figure who came to embody that moment was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, whose youth, eloquence, and vigor seemed to promise renewal, and Dorothy, ever attuned to the currents beneath appearances, felt the pull of politics more strongly than ever before. Her columns, once filled with theater, society, and the amusements of fame, began to carry a sharper edge. She wrote of senators and presidents, of decisions cloaked in rhetoric, of power exercised behind closed doors. She had always possessed an instinct for the hidden story, and now she applied that instinct to the world of Washington. To her, politicians were no different from actors, each delivering lines, each performing for an audience, each concealing behind the performance a tangle of ambition and compromise. She treated them with the same blend of charm and suspicion that she had applied to Broadway's stars. When Kennedy rose to prominence, Dorothy watched with fascination. He was handsome, witty, seemingly effortless in his charisma, and America adored him. Yet Dorothy's eye was not blinded by adoration. She admired his gifts, but she also sensed the contradictions beneath them, the fragility of his health, the complexities of his family's influence, the sharp edges of ambition that underlay the easy smile. She began to weave him into her columns, not only as a figure of glamour but as one of power, scrutinizing the presidency with a precision rare in a time when the press often softened its gaze. Her questions grew bolder. She asked not only about policies but about alliances, about those who hovered around the president's circle, about the shadows that trailed even the brightest light. And as she asked, she drew closer to a dangerous line. For unlike actors or singers, politicians carried secrets that were not merely personal, but national. Secrets bound to military decisions, to intelligence networks, to lives both visible and hidden. To probe these was to move from the safe realm of entertainment into the perilous terrain of governance. Dorothy, however, was not one to retreat when curiosity called. Her presence in Washington became more frequent. She moved among correspondents who had long covered politics, her voice carrying the confidence of one who did not ask permission to enter. She met aides, senators, sources who whispered after hours, their words spilling in the comfort of drink, their faces wary of what she might print. Dorothy listened, as she always had, absorbing details, connecting fragments, building a mosaic of knowledge that reached far beyond what she revealed to her readers. For her public words were only part of the story. Much she carried privately, storing it for the right moment, for the time when the full shape of truth might emerge. The early 60s were years of spectacle. The glamorous dinners, the televised press conferences, the White House celebrated as a modern Camelot. Dorothy observed it all with a mixture of wonder and skepticism. She could appreciate the charm while refusing to be seduced by it. In her, readers found not only admiration, but also the suggestion that beneath the fairy tale lay a story more complicated, more fragile, more human. And in this suggestion, she set herself apart from many of her contemporaries, who preferred to bask in the glow of the Kennedy image rather than examine its shadows. As her attention turned more fully to politics, Dorothy's column shifted. She still reported the amusements of society, but increasingly her words carried the weight of political commentary, her wit now directed at senators, judges, and presidents. Some welcomed her scrutiny, seeing it as a mark of relevance. Others bristled, for Dorothy was not easily swayed by promises of access or by the intimidation of power. She was a journalist first, and she regarded her task as one of service to the public, not to the powerful. This transformation of her focus was not abrupt, but gradual, like the turning of a season. Yet as the season deepened, her reputation altered. She was no longer seen merely as a gossip columnist or television panelist. She was increasingly regarded as a serious journalist, one who dared to tread where others hesitated. And this shift would matter greatly, for it was the foundation upon which her later investigations would stand, the investigations that would carry her into peril. In those early Kennedy years, Dorothy often wrote of optimism and change, but her pen never forgot to ask, what lies behind the curtain? Who whispers in the shadows? What bargains are struck that the public does not see? These questions, gentle at first, grew sharper as time passed, as events unfolded that strained the promise of Camelot and revealed the fragility of its foundations. It was a delicate balance. Too much cynicism, and readers would recoil. Too much admiration, and the truth would be softened. Dorothy managed this balance with skill, offering enough to intrigue, enough to suggest, while always leaving space for reflection. Her readers trusted her because she did not flatter blindly, nor did she condemn without reason. She watched, she listened, she questioned, and in her questioning she offered a mirror to a nation both proud of its youthful leader and uneasy about the storms gathering on the horizon. At times, one imagines Dorothy late at night, returning from a political dinner or an interview, her notes spread upon her desk, the city outside her window silent except for the hum of distant traffic. She must have felt the stir of something larger than herself, the awareness that the stories she now pursued carried a weight beyond celebrity, that they touched upon the very structure of the Republic. Did she feel exhilaration, or did she feel dread? Perhaps both, intertwined, for with knowledge comes both power and burden. The pen scratches across paper, capturing not only the shine of a speech, but the hesitations between sentences, not only the applause of an audience, but the unease in private whispers afterward. And with each stroke, Dorothy steps further into a realm where the stakes rise higher, where the truths she seeks will not be merely embarrassing, but dangerous. The faint scratching of her pen lingers, a sound as persistent as her curiosity, and in that sound, we hear the beginning of a journey that will soon lead her into the tragedy of Dallas and the mystery that would define the last years of her life. The scratching of her pen carries us forward, and then suddenly the sound breaks against a silence so deep it seemed to cover the whole land. It was November 22nd, 1963, when the news came from Dallas that the young president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, had been struck down in the brightness of noon. A motorcade, a smile, a wave, and then gunfire that tore through more than a man's body. It tore through the faith of a nation, leaving in its wake a wound that no passing of years could entirely heal. For Dorothy, the shock was immediate and searing. She was in New York when the word reached her, and like millions, she felt the first tremor of disbelief, the refusal of the heart to accept that something so vital could be extinguished in an instant. The voice of the announcer, heavy with grief, the images on television of crowds gathered in stunned silence, the solemn tones of Walter Cronkite announcing the president's death, all became etched into the nation's collective memory. Dorothy, though, experienced it not only as a citizen but as a journalist, and the questions rose in her as swiftly as the tears. What had happened on that street in Dallas? Who had fired those shots? Why had the corridors of protection meant to shield the president failed so utterly? The official words came quickly. A young man named Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine, a troubled soul, had acted alone, firing from a window in the Texas School Book Depository. The story was neat, almost too neat, delivered with the swiftness of certainty. Yet for Dorothy, whose career had been built on noticing what others ignored, the pieces did not fit so easily. She watched the coverage, listened to the hurried explanations, and felt the tug of doubt. A man like Oswald, obscure and unsteady, suddenly cast as the lone architect of catastrophe. Was it so simple? Dorothy's instincts told her it was not. She began at once to collect fragments, notes, transcripts, reports, anything that might cast light upon the shadows now surrounding the event. She listened as Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner in Dallas, stepped into history by shooting Oswald only 2 days later, silencing the one man who might have explained. The nation gasped, and Dorothy's doubts deepened. Was this, too, coincidence? Or was it part of something larger, hidden from the public eye? She wrote with care in those first days, aware of the grief that weighed upon her readers. Her columns carried both sorrow and inquiry, her words reflecting the pain of the nation while suggesting gently that the story was not as straightforward as it seemed. She understood the delicacy of the moment, yet she could not set aside her questions. They pressed upon her, insistent, demanding to be asked. The bells tolled across America, church bells, school bells, the low notes of mourning. Crowds lined the streets as the casket was borne, the riderless horse following, the muffled drums echoing. Dorothy watched and recorded, but she also wondered. In the silence between tolls, she asked herself, who benefits from this death? Who stands in the shadows while the nation weeps? Such questions were dangerous, yet they came to her as naturally as breath. For Dorothy had always sought the truth beneath appearances, whether in the bright smiles of Broadway stars or the polished speeches of politicians. And now, confronted with the greatest tragedy of her generation, she could not accept without probing. She spoke to colleagues, to sources, to those who had been in Dallas. She followed threads that others dismissed, noting contradictions in witness statements, inconsistencies in the official narrative. Her notebook filled, her pen scratched late into the night. To many, November 22nd was an ending, a fracture beyond repair. To Dorothy, it was also a beginning, the start of a journey that would consume her remaining years, a journey into the labyrinth of hidden power, a pursuit that would bring her into contact with figures who carried secrets too perilous to speak aloud. She knew the cost of such pursuit. She had seen how quickly doors could close, how swiftly powerful figures could turn from charm to hostility. Yet she pressed on, compelled by the same fire that had driven her since girlhood, the refusal to look away when truth hid in shadows. Was it courage, or was it compulsion? Perhaps it was both, woven inseparably in her nature. The bells fade, their toll unanswered. In the silence they leave behind, Dorothy sits with her notes spread before her, her eyes fixed upon a question no mourning can dissolve. Was the young president felled by a single man's hand, or by forces deeper, darker, more entangled with the very fabric of power? It was this question, lingering and unresolved, that would carry her forward, guiding her pen into the perilous corridors of inquiry where few dared to walk. The tolling of the bells lingers, each heavy note dissolving into silence, and from within that silence Dorothy leans forward with her pen, her eyes narrowing upon the pages of testimony and official statements that soon emerged. For the nation, the Warren Commission was meant to provide closure, to gather the fragments of Dallas into a coherent story, to assure the public that justice had been pursued with diligence. But to Dorothy Kilgallen, who had spent her life tracing the fine cracks in polished surfaces, the report seemed more like a curtain drawn hastily across a stage, still echoing with unfinished lines. The commission declared that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone, firing 3 shots from a 6th-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. The report, bound and solemn, carried the weight of authority. Yet as Dorothy read, questions pressed upon her. Witnesses spoke of hearing shots from different directions, yet these accounts were softened, minimized, or set aside. The speed with which the shots were said to have been fired challenged the mechanical limits of the rifle, yet this too was explained away. And the most haunting detail of all, the silencing of Oswald by Jack Ruby only 2 days after his arrest, was presented as though it had no deeper significance. Dorothy was not persuaded. She sensed the pattern of a story too neatly tied, as though threads had been pulled taut to prevent unraveling. She spoke to those who had been in Dallas, to lawyers, to acquaintances of Ruby, gathering impressions that rarely made their way into print, but filled her notebooks. She learned of Ruby's ties to law enforcement, his connections to the underworld, the strange ease with which he entered the police basement to fire the shot that ended Oswald's life. Could this, Dorothy wondered, truly be explained as the impulsive act of a distraught nightclub owner? Or was it part of something larger, something concealed? Her colleagues sometimes urged caution. The public was weary of grief, they said. The people wanted closure, not more questions. Yet Dorothy could not set her doubts aside. She had built her career on refusing the easy answer, and she knew that history itself could be shaped by whether truth was pursued or ignored. Late into the night she wrote, her handwriting looping across pages, her cigarette burning low in the ashtray, her lamp the only light in the townhouse as the city outside fell to sleep. She began to craft columns that hinted at her unease. She wrote of contradictions, of missing pieces, of questions unanswered. Her readers, already familiar with her fearlessness, leaned closer to these words, sensing the weight behind them. Some nodded in agreement. Their own doubts affirmed. Others dismissed her suspicions as imagination. Yet the questions spread, carried on Dorothy's voice into parlors and kitchens, unsettling the fragile comfort the Warren report had tried to establish. It was a dangerous path, for those who asked such questions often found themselves isolated. To challenge an official account was to risk being branded reckless, conspiratorial, unpatriotic even. But Dorothy carried on, her confidence bolstered by her conviction that journalism's duty was not to soothe, but to seek. She pressed for interviews, sought out those on the edges of the case, listened for details overlooked. Each new fragment deepened her conviction that the truth was more tangled than the commission allowed. One night she sat across from an acquaintance of Ruby's, the air thick with smoke, the clink of glasses marking the pauses in conversation. The man spoke in half-confidences, nervous, his words slipping like shadows. Dorothy leaned forward, her pen poised, her questions sharp but gentle, coaxing more from him than he intended. Later, as she walked home through the dim streets, she felt the thrill of discovery mingled with the chill of risk. For knowledge is never without cost, and the truths she gathered pressed against walls, stronger than those of celebrity scandal. At times, she confided to friends that she had information so startling it could shake the foundations of the case. She hinted that she was preparing something larger, a revelation that would one day be published. These hints became part of her aura, feeding the sense that she walked with knowledge others dared not touch. Yet she was careful, for she knew the danger of revealing too much too soon. Her notes, scribbled and stored, grew into a collection she guarded closely, as though aware that within them lay not only answers but also peril. Still, she remained undaunted. Her columns continued, her presence on What's My Line, carried on, her public face as poised and charming as ever. But behind the smile, behind the arch of an eyebrow, there lingered the relentless mind of a woman unwilling to yield. To many viewers, she was simply Dorothy, the witty panelist in a glamorous gown. To those who followed her writings closely, she was something more, the journalist who dared to suggest that the story of Dallas was not yet told. Her pen scratched again, late into the night, across papers spread upon her desk. The scratching carried the urgency of a woman racing not against time, but against silence. She knew that powerful forces preferred silence, that the neat narrative of the Warren Commission was safer for all. Yet she could not silence her own questions, nor ignore the voices of those who whispered to her in confidence. And so the scratching continues, a steady sound in the night, each word another step into the labyrinth. The folder upon her desk closes softly, but not with finality. It waits, its contents unresolved, its questions lingering in the air. And with that closed folder, we step forward, listening now to the turn of a key in a lock, as Dorothy begins to gather information not merely from sources in print, but from informants who opened doors into shadows few dared to enter. The soft turn of the key in the lock ushers us deeper, and behind that door lies a realm of whispers and confidences, where truth emerges not in public hearings, but in hushed conversations shared between those who know too much and those who dare to ask. It was in this realm that Dorothy Kilgallen now moved, her notebook, her passport, her questions, her lantern. For the assassination of the president had left a trail not only of grief, but of silenced voices, and Dorothy, fearless, sought them out one by one. Among the most dangerous paths she trod was her pursuit of Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who had stepped forward in the basement of a Dallas police station and fired the shot that forever sealed Oswald's lips. To most of America, Ruby was an enigma. His act explained away as sudden passion, a desperate gesture of loyalty to a slain leader. But Dorothy sensed otherwise. She saw in Ruby's connections to police, to local officials, to the rougher edges of Dallas nightlife, a tapestry far too complex to be dismissed as impulse. She did not rest content with official statements. She sought out Ruby's friends, his acquaintances, his lawyer. And in time, remarkably, she secured a private interview with Ruby himself, then confined in jail. It was a meeting few reporters ever achieved, and it revealed Dorothy's singular determination. Accounts suggest she spoke with Ruby for hours, drawing from him fragments that only deepened her conviction that the story was far from complete. Ruby spoke of fears, of forces beyond his control, of shadows he dared not name. Dorothy listened, her mind racing, her pen scratching quickly, knowing that each word might open new corridors of inquiry. What exactly Ruby told her remains a mystery. Dorothy never published all that she learned, keeping much of it in her private notes. She hinted to friends and colleagues that she possessed information too explosive to reveal casually, information that might one day shake the official narrative to its foundations. She promised that in time she would release it, but that time never came. Those notes, some vanished after her death, others perhaps hidden still, remain among the most tantalizing fragments of her story. Her pursuit did not end with Ruby. She traced Oswald's path as well, examining his life with the precision of one who refuses to accept simple answers. The young man painted as a solitary misfit appeared, upon closer inspection, surrounded by strange coincidences: his defection to the Soviet Union and sudden return, his entanglements with shadowy figures in New Orleans, his employment in Dallas only weeks before the president's motorcade passed below the window where he worked. Dorothy gathered these strands with care, sketching in her mind a picture far larger than the lone gunman of the Commission's report. She met with sources who spoke of Cuban exiles, of intelligence operations, of the tangled web of Cold War intrigue. Some spoke freely, others hesitated, their eyes darting as though expecting to be overheard. Dorothy pressed gently, as she always did, coaxing details without frightening them into silence. She had the gift of seeming confidant even while extracting truths, and this gift served her now as she navigated the dangerous waters of hidden power. But with each step, the risk grew heavier. Friends noticed her unease, the way she sometimes looked over her shoulder, the way she hinted that she knew things that placed her in danger. She confided to a few that if anything ever happened to her, her notes would explain why. Such confessions, half in jest, half in earnest, carry the weight of foreboding when we look back upon them now. Still, Dorothy pressed forward. Courage, compulsion, or destiny, it matters little which word we choose, for the result was the same. She could not let go. She wrote columns that questioned, that hinted, that unsettled. She prepared drafts for a book, a fuller account of the assassination and its hidden dimensions. She believed the public had a right to know, and she felt herself uniquely placed to reveal what others dared not. Was she reckless, or was she faithful to the very essence of her craft? Perhaps both. Journalism, at its truest, is an act of faith that truth matters, that silence must be broken. Dorothy lived that faith with every word she wrote. Yet in doing so, she carried a weight that grew heavier each day, a weight of knowledge, of fear, of the unspoken awareness that forces larger than herself watched closely. Her colleagues admired her boldness but worried. They warned her to be careful, to remember that she was not invulnerable. Dorothy listened, but she did not turn back. She laughed, perhaps, dismissing their concern, yet inside she knew the peril. Each new note she scribbled was another step along a narrowing path, a path that led deeper into shadow. The folder on her desk grew thick, filled with names, dates, questions, connections. Some nights she placed it beneath her pillow as though to keep it safe, as though in sleep her mind still turned upon its contents. To her children she remained mother. To her viewers she remained the witty panelist. To her readers she was the sharp columnist. But to herself, in those private hours, she was a seeker of dangerous truths, one who walked alone with knowledge others would rather bury. And so the sound of footsteps begins to echo behind her. Footsteps faint at first, then louder, the kind that follow without revealing themselves. In those footsteps, we hear the beginning of another chapter, one not of discovery but of isolation, as Dorothy's pursuit drew her further from safety and deeper into the loneliness of suspicion. The footsteps echo softly behind her, never quite close, never quite distant, and in their rhythm, Dorothy begins to sense the weight of isolation pressing upon her. For in the weeks and months after her meeting with Jack Ruby and the gathering of whispers too fragile for print, she carried not only notes and suspicions, but also the uneasy awareness that she was being watched. The journalist, who had once moved so confidently through crowded nightclubs and glittering studios, now felt, in quieter moments, that unseen eyes followed her, that the very questions she asked might be marked by others as transgressions too dangerous to permit. Friends noticed a change in her. She laughed still, spoke with wit still, carried her charm into public gatherings. Yet in private, she sometimes lowered her voice, as though the walls themselves might lean forward to listen. To some, she confided hints of her unease, saying that she had discovered things that placed her in jeopardy, things so important she must keep them safe. She joked, half in earnest, that if anything ever happened to her, her notes would explain why. Such words, spoken lightly perhaps in the moment, gained a terrible gravity when her story reached its end. Isolation for a seeker of truth can be as perilous as open threat. Dorothy had lived her life in the company of others, editors, colleagues, celebrities, politicians. But now she felt the space around her narrowing. The journalists who once shared her curiosity now warned her away. The officials she questioned closed doors more firmly. Even some friends counseled caution, urging her to let the matter rest, to accept the Warren Commission's verdict and move on. but Dorothy could not move on. To do so would be to betray not only her craft but herself, for she had always believed that silence in the face of doubt was a kind of complicity, and so she pressed on, though each step deepened her solitude. She worked late into the night, the lamp on her desk, the only light, her ashtray filling with the remains of cigarettes smoked in restless concentration. The city outside her window continued in its endless rhythm, taxis rushing, sirens wailing, voices rising from the street. Yet Dorothy sat apart, her mind turning upon the fragments of testimony, the contradictions in official accounts, the whispered hints from informants. Each detail drew her further into the labyrinth, and each detail made her more aware that she walked largely alone. It is not easy to bear such loneliness. Those who have carried dangerous knowledge speak of the burden as a shadow upon the spirit, a weight that follows even into sleep. Dorothy must have felt this, lying awake in the quiet hours, listening to the creak of her townhouse, wondering whether the silence concealed a presence beyond her control. She was not one given to paranoia, but neither was she naive. She knew enough of the world to understand that information can be as lethal as a weapon, and she had begun to assemble information that others might wish to bury forever. The footsteps behind her became more than a feeling. Once or twice she noticed a car parked near her home that seemed to linger too long. At times she remarked that her telephone carried an echo, as though another line listened in. She mentioned these things in passing, never with hysteria, but with the calm suspicion of one who knows that coincidence is not always innocent. Those who heard her shrugged, uncertain whether to believe such fears, yet Dorothy herself did not dismiss them. They were part of the landscape in which she now lived, the landscape of isolation and risk. Still, her public face never faltered. On What's My Line? She continued to sparkle, to laugh, to delight audiences with her quick wit. In her column, she still wrote of society and theater, still offered readers the brightness they expected. Yet beneath the surface, she carried on her inquiry, her secret labor of assembling the hidden pieces of Dallas. She lived a dual life more profound than ever before, the celebrated figure of television and print on one side, the solitary seeker of dangerous truths on the other. In this duality there lay both strength and sorrow. Strength, because it allowed her to move unnoticed, to cloak her investigations beneath the ordinary routines of her career. Sorrow, because it meant she carried her heaviest burden alone, without the comfort of companions who fully understood. She trusted few, revealed little, kept her notes guarded, sometimes even hiding them beneath her pillow as if to shield them through the night. The loneliness was not without toll. Those close to her observed moments of weariness, of sadness, of the kind of quiet despair that comes not from failure, but from the knowledge of peril unshared. Dorothy was not a woman given to surrender, but even the strongest grow tired when they walk long in shadow. She sought relief sometimes in nights out, in laughter among acquaintances, in the warmth of conversation and drink. Yet always the shadow returned, waiting when the music ended, when the crowd dispersed, when she found herself alone again with her notes. One wonders how often she asked herself whether it was worth it. Did she weigh the value of revelation against the cost of solitude? Did she ever consider setting her notes aside, turning her attention back to the safer ground of celebrity and society? Perhaps she did, in moments of exhaustion. But if she did, those thoughts never triumphed. Dorothy had chosen her path long ago, when she first pressed her ear to the sound of her father's typewriter, when she first learned that the purpose of journalism was not comfort, but clarity. She could no more abandon the truth than she could abandon her own voice. And so the footsteps followed, steady, persistent, a reminder that the path she walked was not unobserved. In their echo, we sense the tightening of the net, the drawing nearer of forces she could not name but could not ignore. Isolation had become her companion, suspicion her shadow. And from this uneasy companionship she moved forward still, her pen poised, her questions sharper than ever, her resolve unbroken. The echo of those footsteps fades into the clink of a glass, left half empty on a nightclub table. For even as she carried the burden of dangerous truths, Dorothy sought at times to slip away into the half-light of late evenings, into the company of laughter and distraction, into the fragile refuge of forgetting for a little while. And it is into that refuge we follow her now, as the music begins to rise once more. The glass sits half empty on the nightclub table, its rim touched with a trace of lipstick, its contents reflecting the dim glow of colored lights. Around Dorothy rises the hum of conversation, the shuffle of feet, the laughter of those seeking forgetfulness in music and drink. Here, in these late hours, she allowed herself a measure of escape, a drifting from the weight of questions into the easier company of diversion. Yet even in such places, surrounded by the warmth of companions and the pulse of jazz, she carried with her the invisible satchel of secrets, never fully able to set it aside. New York at night in the early 1960s was alive with rhythm. Clubs along the avenues throbbed with songs, cigarettes glowed in the dark, and the air was thick with perfume and smoke. Dorothy moved through this world like both participant and observer, her smile genuine enough to invite camaraderie, yet her eyes always lingering a moment longer, always seeing more than others intended to reveal. Those who shared her table sometimes forgot that the woman laughing at their jokes, raising her glass to their toasts, was also the journalist who could transform their words into tomorrow's column. Yet by now her reputation was such that even those who feared her pen still sought her company, drawn by the magnetism of her presence. But beneath the surface of laughter, Dorothy carried weariness. The investigation that occupied her mind was not the sort of pursuit that allowed rest. The assassination of the president, the silence imposed upon Oswald by Ruby's bullet, the countless contradictions she had uncovered, all of these weighed heavily even in moments of apparent ease. And so her nights in these clubs were a kind of balancing act, one part refuge, one part disguise. The music lifted her spirits, yet the shadows at the edge of the room never disappeared entirely. There were evenings when she drank more than she intended. The weight of solitude eased for a while in the warmth of liquor and the comfort of companionship. Some would later seize upon these nights as evidence of recklessness, of weakness, as though to admit fatigue or sadness were to undo her brilliance. Yet in truth they reveal her humanity, the simple truth that even the strongest seek shelter when storms press too long. Dorothy was not immune to longing, to the need for rest, to the fragile relief of forgetting. But when the music ended and the club emptied, she always returned to her notes, to her desk, to the scratching of her pen. The duality of her life became ever more stark. The glamorous panelist on television, the feared columnist in print, the solitary investigator in the quiet of night, and the weary woman seeking distraction in dimly lit rooms. Each of these Dorothys was real, and together they formed the whole of her being. To the public, she was unflinching, always poised, always in control. To her friends, she was witty, sometimes playful, sometimes sharp. But to herself, in the quiet between songs, she was aware of the cracks, of the growing tension between her outer image and her inner burden. Perhaps she wondered, as she sat in those clubs with her glass half empty, whether she could ever truly set the weight down. Was there a life in which she might have written only of theater, of music, of the sparkling entertainments that had first brought her fame? Could she have been content as the nation's charming panelist, adored for her gowns and her wit, without probing into the dangerous corridors of power? If such thoughts came, they did not hold her long, for Dorothy was never one to settle for half-truths, and she knew that the questions pressing upon her heart would not release her simply because she wished it so. And so, even in her moments of escape, she gathered fragments, conversations overheard, rumors whispered in the noise of the club, the slip of a tongue after a third drink. Each might later find its way into her notebooks. Dorothy never ceased to be a journalist, even when she appeared most at leisure. It was both her gift and her curse, to see meaning where others saw only passing chatter, to hear in laughter the faint undertone of fear. Those who sat with her sometimes confided more than they intended. They felt safe in the cocoon of music, in the apparent frivolity of the night. Dorothy listened, her laughter mingling with theirs, but her memory storing each word with precision. Later, in the solitude of her study, she would sift through these fragments, weighing them against the larger picture she was assembling. Thus, even the nightclub, the place of escape, became another chamber of inquiry. Yet the cost of this life was not small. The long nights, the restless drinking, the burden of secrets, all carved slowly upon her health, upon her spirit. Dorothy remained radiant in public, but those who knew her well sometimes glimpsed the fatigue behind her eyes, the sadness beneath her smile. They urged her to slow down, to rest, to guard herself. But Dorothy had never been one to retreat. The same fire that had driven her from her father's typewriter to the columns of national newspapers now drove her deeper into peril, and no amount of caution could extinguish it. The clinking of her glass fades as the music draws to a close, the crowd dispersing into the cool air of early morning. Dorothy steps out into the night, the city quiet now, the lamplight casting long shadows across the pavement. The relief she sought is already fading, replaced once more by the restless pull of her investigation. She walks home through the silence, her thoughts returning again to Ruby, to Oswald, to the fragments that refuse to settle into coherence. The nightclub has given her a few hours of forgetting, but now the burden returns, heavier than before. She closes her door behind her, the townhouse settling into its familiar creaks. The gown is set aside, the glass of water placed on her bedside table. Yet even before she sleeps, she reaches again for her notes, as though compelled, unable to leave them untouched. The lamplight flickers over the pages, the pen begins to scratch once more, and the night deepens around her. The clinking glass has led us here, back to the solitude of her home, where private burdens meet private sorrows. And it is here, in the quiet of her marriage and the unraveling of bonds that once promised comfort, that we must follow her next, for the decline of her domestic world weighed as heavily as any investigation, shaping the woman she became in ways few understood. The lamplight flickers across her notes, casting shadows upon the bedroom walls, and beyond those walls lies another silence, heavier than the city's night, the silence of a marriage slowly unraveling. Dorothy had once stepped into matrimony with hope, believing that her union with Richard Colmar would be a partnership of equals, each supporting the other's pursuits, each balancing the other's burdens. But as the years wore on, that hope thinned like smoke, until the rooms of their townhouse carried more echoes than laughter. It was not one moment that broke the bond, but a long accumulation of disappointments, betrayals, and unspoken grievances, which settled upon them like dust that no hand bothered to sweep away. Richard had charm and talent, but his career never reached the steady heights Dorothy's did. For a man raised in a world that measured worth by achievement, her success could not help but cast a long shadow. She commanded a national audience, her columns read by millions, her face known to every household with a television. Richard, by contrast, drifted between ventures, acting, producing, radio, never quite finding the triumph that might steady his pride. Some said he turned increasingly to drink, some whispered of infidelities. Whether these whispers were true in every detail matters less than the truth Dorothy herself felt, that the man who should have been her partner was often distant, absent, or unreliable, even as she bore the weight of both career and household. Their children brought moments of warmth, anchors amid the strain. Dorothy loved them fiercely, shielding them as best she could from the tensions between their parents. She balanced the role of mother with the relentless pace of journalist, a balance that demanded more from her than most could give. There must have been nights when she returned from the studio or from an interview with a political figure, exhausted yet still compelled to sit at the bedside of a child, to whisper reassurance, to hold close what fragments of family could be held together. In those moments, she carried herself not as the public figure adored by millions, but as a mother determined not to let the fractures of her marriage spill over onto her children. Yet even in her devotion, the strain weighed upon her. For what is it to share a home with one whose presence no longer comforts, to sit across the dinner table in silence, to sense betrayal, yet find no words to confront it? Dorothy, who asked questions fearlessly in public, sometimes chose silence at home, not from weakness, but from weariness. She was already engaged in battles beyond her walls, battles with secrecy and deception at the highest levels of power. To wage a second battle within her own home must have seemed unbearable. And so she endured, holding the appearance of unity even as the truth dissolved beneath it. Friends noticed the distance between them. At gatherings, Dorothy often appeared alone, her wit brightening the room, while Richard hovered at the edges or disappeared altogether. Those who observed closely sensed the gulf widening, though few dared to comment. In that era, appearances mattered, and Dorothy, ever aware of perception, allowed the illusion of marriage to stand, even as the substance faltered. Her notebooks reveal no confessions of despair, yet the sadness could be read in her eyes by those who knew her best. It is possible that in her loneliness she poured more of herself into her work, finding in the pursuit of truth the intensity and focus absent from her personal life. The questions of Dallas, of Ruby, of Oswald, these gave her purpose, a fire that burned brighter, perhaps, because her hearth at home had grown cold. For Dorothy, truth was not only a professional calling, it became a refuge from the disappointments of love. Yet even in disappointment, there was resilience. Dorothy did not crumble, did not retreat into bitterness. She carried herself with dignity, continued to host her children, continued to maintain the appearances demanded of her position. In public, she remained poised, her smile never faltering, her laughter still genuine when occasion called for it. To the world, she was Dorothy Kilgallen, the fearless journalist, the sparkling panelist, the elegant figure whose wit charmed millions. Only behind closed doors did the shadows gather, whispering of a marriage that no longer nourished her spirit. It is in such dualities that we often glimpse the true measure of a person. Dorothy's ability to endure private sorrow while pursuing public truth reveals a strength beyond the ordinary. But it also reveals the cost. To live divided, to carry within oneself both determination and disappointment, is to be stretched across a gulf that grows wider with time. Each day she pressed further into her investigations. Each night she returned to a house that no longer gave her peace. One imagines her in those evenings, the children asleep, the townhouse quiet save for the faint creak of timbers, Richard absent or withdrawn. She sits at her desk, the glow of her lamp casting her figure in solitude. The pen scratches, the cigarette smoke curls, the notes pile higher. Around her is silence, but within her mind is the storm of questions. And perhaps, in a moment of stillness, she glances at the empty chair across the room, remembering the promise of companionship that never materialized, feeling the hollow echo where partnership once might have been. Such images remind us that the pursuit of truth is never abstract. It is always carried out by human beings, with their own burdens, their own frailties. Dorothy's determination to expose deception in public was surely sharpened by the deception she felt in her own private world. The same intuition that told her when a politician lied must have been honed by the intimate knowledge of when love had faltered. Her personal life and her professional life, though separate in appearance, were bound together in the shaping of her spirit. And so the lamp eventually flickers, is turned off, leaving only the faint light of moon across the floor. The household sleeps, the silence presses in. Dorothy lies awake, her thoughts restless, her heart burdened. In the half-darkness she hears the faintest sound, the brushing of curtains as a draft passes through an open window, a reminder that shadows move even in the stillness. It is with this image, the window, the shifting of a curtain, the fragile intrusion of night, that we step forward. For Dorothy's story now leads us into the final phase of her investigation, when her boldest interviews and her most daring notes brought her perilously close to revelations others wish to keep forever in the dark. The curtain shifts gently in the night air, a soft movement that might seem innocent, yet carries with it the suggestion of something unseen beyond the window. It is within this image of subtle intrusion that we find Dorothy again, her pen poised, her thoughts racing, her resolve deepening. For in the final phase of her work, she stepped closer than ever to the dangerous heart of the Kennedy assassination, closer to truths that others whispered only in guarded tones, closer to the threshold where knowledge itself becomes peril. She'd already spoken with Jack Ruby, had already gathered fragments from his trembling words, but she was not content to leave it there. She sought out his lawyer, Melvin Belly, a man known for both flamboyance and skill, whose defense of Ruby had made headlines. Dorothy pressed him for insight, for details that the public had never been told. She listened as he described Ruby's fragile state of mind, his rambling fears, his hints at forces larger than himself. From such conversations, Dorothy drew a picture not of a lone, impulsive nightclub owner, but of a man caught in a web of connections that reached into places best left unspoken. She did not hoard these encounters for her amusement or prestige. She poured them into her notes, shaping drafts for articles, preparing material for a book she promised would shake the foundations of the case. To friends, she hinted that what she had uncovered was extraordinary, that she held knowledge the public had a right to see. At times, she seemed almost exhilarated, as though standing on the brink of revelation. At other times, her tone darkened, her words shadowed by an awareness of risk. She confided that she must be careful, that powerful interests would not welcome the truths she intended to print. In those final months of her life, Dorothy worked with an intensity that startled even those accustomed to her tireless pace. Her notes piled higher, her interviews grew bolder, her questions cut deeper. She spoke with insiders, with figures who hinted at intelligence operations, at hidden hands guiding events from behind the stage. She followed leads into Cuba, into whispers of organized crime, into connections that stretched far beyond Dallas. Each new fragment widened the scope of her inquiry until the assassination seemed less an isolated tragedy than the visible eruption of something vast and hidden. What she wrote in those pages we may never fully know. Some of her notes vanished after her death. Others were scattered, some perhaps destroyed. But those who saw them before they disappeared spoke of material that was indeed explosive. Material that cast doubt upon the official story and suggested a conspiracy too tangled for the Commission's tidy conclusions. Dorothy herself spoke of her determination to finish her book, to reveal to the world what she had uncovered. She had become, in her own eyes, not merely a journalist, but a witness called to testify before history. Yet even as she pressed forward, the shadows around her grew heavier. She noticed things again. A figure watching too long, a telephone line that carried faint echoes, a letter misplaced. She spoke of her unease, though often lightly, as if not wishing to burden her friends with fear. Still, the sense of being observed never left her. It hovered in her home, in her travels, in the very air she breathed, and beneath it all lay the awareness that time was running short. In her columns, she began to hint more boldly, suggesting that the Warren report was flawed, that Americans had been misled. She described Ruby's testimony as revealing, his demeanor as troubled, his case as more complex than officials admitted. Readers leaned closer, sensing that Dorothy was edging towards something larger. Some praised her courage, others dismissed her suspicions as imagination. But Dorothy cared little for their judgment. She cared only for the truth, for the story she believed she was destined to tell. One imagines her late at night, the curtain shifting in the draft, her desk crowded with papers, her cigarette burning low. Her eyes scan the notes, her mind turning upon each detail, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle that resists completion. At moments, she feels clarity, a glimpse of the whole pattern. At others, she feels only frustration, the sense that the truth always slips just beyond her grasp. Yet she persists, for persistence was her nature, and she could not let the matter rest. She was preparing for publication, preparing to share what she had learned. But destiny intervened before those preparations could be fulfilled. The image of the curtain shifting becomes now a symbol of what was to come, of the unseen forces moving quietly around her, of the danger pressing nearer each day. For while Dorothy sharpened her pen for the final revelations, the shadows gathered more closely, ready to silence the journalist who had walked too far into the dark. The stack of papers lies upon her bed, placed there as though she wished to keep them within reach even in sleep. They rest not with finality, but with promise, a promise unfulfilled. And as the night deepens, the sound of the curtain brushing the wall fades into the stillness of early morning, into the silence that foreshadows her final night. The silence of early morning holds steady, the curtain resting still at last, and into this stillness we must now step with care, for it leads us into Dorothy's final night, a night wrapped in mystery as thick as the questions she herself once posed. It was November the 8th, 1965, when the city woke to the news that Dorothy Kilgallen, bright of wit, relentless of pen, had been found lifeless in her townhouse, her body reclined upon her bed as though she had slipped peacefully into sleep. Yet the details, when examined, left not peace but unease, a constellation of contradictions that would linger for decades. She had spent that evening at the theater attending a performance as she so often did, moving among friends and acquaintances with her usual grace. Those who saw her recalled her laughter, her sharp observations, her vitality undiminished. There was no sign of despair, no gesture that hinted at farewell. She returned home late, her chauffeur delivering her safely to the door. Within those familiar walls, she ascended to her bedroom, where notes and papers awaited her, as they always did. There, sometime in the hours that followed, her life came to its end. The official ruling declared overdose, barbiturates and alcohol mingled in her blood, enough to silence the mind and still the heart. Yet those who knew her best questioned at once. Dorothy was not reckless with her medicines, nor prone to self-destruction. She was a woman still in pursuit, still writing, still preparing a book she believed would be her great revelation. Why would she abandon that purpose? Why would she surrender when she was so close to publication, so near to the unveiling of what she had labored to uncover? The questions pressed, and no answers came. More troubling still were the details. She was found not in her own bed, but in the room of another floor, a place she rarely used. The book upon her nightstand was one she had already finished, not the volume she had been reading days before. The notes she had guarded so fiercely, her interviews, her fragments, her drafts, were missing, vanished as though carried off by unseen hands. Her appearance suggested not disorder but arrangement, as though the scene itself had been tidied. To some, these details whispered of intrusion, of interference, of a hand at work beyond her own. Friends remembered her words, spoken in jest yet heavy with foreboding. If anything happened to her, she had told them, her notes would explain why. Now she was gone and her notes were nowhere to be found. The irony was cruel, almost unbearable, as though she herself had foretold the silence that would swallow her. Some believed it was suicide, a collapse under the burden of investigation and loneliness. Others believed it was an accident, a miscalculation of medicines taken in weariness. But still others, more suspicious, believed she had been silenced, her death arranged to protect the secrets she carried. the city responded with shock. Colleagues, readers, viewers mourned her, remembering the wit that had brightened their evenings, the sharpness that had pierced through the veils of celebrity and politics alike. Yet even in mourning, whispers spread. Did she truly die by her own hand, or had her pursuit of hidden truths drawn the attention of forces that preferred her silence? The ambiguity became part of her legacy, as inextricable from her story as the very investigations that had defined her. Her funeral was attended by family, friends, colleagues, and admirers, the pews filled with those who had known her in one way or another. Eulogies spoke of her brilliance, her courage, her contribution to journalism. But outside the church, the questions remained. They lingered on street corners, in newspaper offices, in whispers exchanged late at night. The truth, so fiercely sought by Dorothy herself, seemed to retreat even further into shadow at the moment of her passing, and so her final night remains a riddle, suspended between possibilities. Did she falter in exhaustion, turn at last to rest in a way that left her vulnerable to medicine and drink? Did she, weary of the burdens of investigation and the loneliness of her private life, choose to depart willingly? Or was her silence imposed, her life ended by hands determined to erase what her pen threatened to reveal? Each possibility has its defenders, each its evidence, yet none has triumphed with certainty. Her death, like the assassination she investigated, remains enveloped in mystery. The townhouse stood quiet after her passing, its rooms still carrying the echoes of typewriter keys, of laughter, of whispered conversations. The children mourned, the husband drifted further into shadow, the city moved on. But for those who cared to look more deeply, the absence of her notes became as haunting as her death itself. Papers once promised, drafts once spoken of, revelations she claimed to hold, all vanished. It was as though she had been erased, not only in body but in word, her legacy reduced to silence at the very moment it might have spoken loudest. Yet silence, too, speaks. It speaks in the unease of those who recall her final days. It speaks in the contradictions of the scene, in the missing notes, in the disappearance of a voice so vital. And in that silence we find not closure but invitation to question, to doubt, to remember that truth rarely yields itself easily. Dorothy, who had spent her life reminding others of this, left behind in her own death the ultimate reminder that some stories remain unfinished, some questions remain open, some voices echo on even after they are stilled. The curtain at her window no longer shifts. The air is still. Yet in that stillness lies the lingering presence of all she carried, all she sought, all she risked. Her final night closes not with certainty but with a question that hums like a wire in the silence. Did Dorothy Kilgallen die of her own choices, or was she silenced for the truths she refused to abandon? The curtain drifts once more, faintly as though stirred by an unseen hand. And in that drifting we step onward into the aftermath of her passing, where grief gave way to suspicion, and where missing pages whispered more loudly than words ever printed. The curtain drifts faintly, stirred by no visible hand, and beyond its movement lies the silence that followed Dorothy's death, a silence filled not with peace, but with unanswered questions. In the days after November the 8th, 1965, her townhouse became a place of sorrow and suspicion, her absence felt as a hollow in every room. For her family, it was grief of the deepest kind, children robbed of a mother, a household stripped of its heart. For her colleagues, it was shock, mingled with disbelief, the sudden ending of a life so filled with energy, so filled with unfinished words. For the city and the nation, it was bewilderment, the vanishing of a familiar voice whose wit had filled their evenings and whose pen had sharpened their awareness. The newspapers that had once carried her columns now carried her obituary. They spoke of her brilliance, her charm, her accomplishments. They praised her courage, her style, her wit. But between the lines and in the whispers that filled newsrooms, another theme emerged: unease. Many knew of her obsession with the Kennedy assassination, her determination to publish revelations others had left untouched. Many had heard her speak of explosive information she intended to release. Now she was gone, and with her had vanished the notes and drafts she'd guarded so closely. The coincidence was too striking, the disappearance too convenient, for suspicion not to take root. Her friends recalled her last words, her last gestures. She'd not seemed despondent, they said. She had not seemed ready to surrender life. On the contrary, she had spoken of her book with determination, had promised disclosures that would startle the nation. How could such a woman, on the brink of revelation, suddenly choose silence? Some spoke of exhaustion, of the loneliness of her marriage, of the toll of her double life. Others spoke of accident, a tragic miscalculation of medicine and drink, but still others whispered of something darker, that she had been silenced deliberately, her work confiscated, her voice stilled because it carried truths too dangerous to allow. The missing notes became the heart of the mystery. In the days after her death, searchers found no trace of the thick folder she had often spoken of, no drafts of the book she claimed was nearly complete. The papers that had rested upon her pillow, that she had guarded so fiercely, were nowhere to be seen. Her family could not produce them, her editors did not receive them, her colleagues could not explain them. It was as though they had dissolved into air. And yet, those who had glimpsed them before her death insisted they existed, that she had indeed gathered material of significance. Their disappearance lent weight to the suspicions of those who believed she had been silenced. For her children, too young to grasp the full complexity of their mother's life, the loss was simple and profound. They remembered her laughter, her presence at their bedsides, her fierce devotion even amid her relentless work. They could not understand why she had been taken, nor why questions about her death lingered unanswered. For them, the mystery was less about notes or conspiracies than about the ache of absence, the void left by a mother's love. For her husband, Richard Calmer, grief mingled with detachment. Their marriage had long been troubled, their bond frayed. His response to her passing struck some as strangely muted, as though shaped more by resignation than by anguish. He offered little clarity about the missing notes, little explanation for the inconsistencies. To some, his silence was natural, the silence of a man overwhelmed by loss. To others, it appeared evasive, another layer of mystery surrounding Dorothy's final days. Colleagues in journalism mourned, but also questioned. Some spoke openly of their suspicions, of their belief that Dorothy had been silenced. Others cautioned restraint, unwilling to voice accusations without proof. Yet even among the cautious, there lingered unease. For they knew Dorothy's determination, her refusal to abandon a story when she had set her teeth upon it. They knew she had not been finished. Her story was still unfolding, and its sudden end bore the marks of interruption. Readers across the nation, too, sensed something strange. Letters poured into newspapers. Voices on radio programs spoke of doubt. How could a journalist who had spent her life pursuing hidden truths die in such obscurity? Her work unfinished, her words erased. The public, who had once trusted her to pierce through the illusions of Broadway and Washington alike, now found themselves without her guidance, left only with the shadow of questions she had left behind. In the weeks that followed, the story of her death slowly receded from the headlines, overtaken by other events, other distractions. Yet the memory did not fade. For those who admired her, the unease became a permanent echo, a reminder that some mysteries are never resolved, that some truths are buried not by chance, but by design. Imagine her townhouse in those days after, its rooms silent, her typewriter idle, her notes gone. The desk where she had labored late into the night stood empty, the cigarette butts cleared away, the lamp no longer burning. Yet in that emptiness there lingered presence, the sense of a woman who had not finished, whose spirit pressed still upon the walls. Friends who entered spoke of the silence as heavy, as though the house itself mourned not only her absence, but the silencing of the stories she had carried. The rustle of papers no longer in their place became the most haunting sound of all. Not the sound itself, but the absence. The silence where rustling should have been, the emptiness where drafts should have lain. In that absence, suspicion grew, feeding upon itself, becoming legend. For sometimes what is missing speaks louder than what is found, and in Dorothy's case, the missing words became her final testament. And so, in the aftermath of her death, grief gave way to suspicion, mourning to mystery. Her friends, her colleagues, her readers, all were left with the same unanswered question. What did Dorothy know, and what became of the truths she had been preparing to reveal? The rustling silence leads us now into the next chamber, where theories and suspicions gathered, where the story of her life began to blend with legend, and where the figure of Dorothy Kilgallen became not only a journalist, but a symbol of secrets too perilous to speak aloud. The rustling silence of missing papers lingers, and from that silence arises a chorus of voices, speculation, suspicion, theory, that surrounds Dorothy's death as thickly as smoke after a fire. For when facts recede, imagination rushes in, and so it was with her passing. The story of Dorothy Kilgallen became not only one of loss, but of mystery, one retold again and again in the language of conjecture, until it began to blur the line between history and legend. In the first weeks after her death, theories sprouted quickly. Some insisted she had been silenced, her revelations too dangerous to permit. They pointed to the missing notes, to the inconsistencies in the scene, to her confident promises of an impending book. To them, the explanation of accidental overdose was a veil, hastily drawn, concealing a darker truth. Others, less certain of conspiracy, spoke of exhaustion, of the lonely strain of her private life, of the late nights of drink and medicine that might have led to an unintended end. A few even whispered of despair, though this explanation convinced almost none who knew her well, for Dorothy was still a light with purpose, still driven by a will not easily extinguished. Over time, writers and researchers added layers to the debate. Some uncovered fragments suggesting her notes had indeed been confiscated, their contents erased before they could reach the public. Others traced her connections to witnesses, to Ruby's confidants, to informants who may have told her too much. A picture emerged of a journalist on the brink of revelation, whose sudden death served the convenience of those invested in silence. Yet certainty remained elusive, for the evidence was always partial, the documentation incomplete, the testimony clouded by memory and fear. Her death became twinned with the very case she investigated. Just as the assassination of Kennedy inspired 1,000 theories, so too did Dorothy's passing. And in both, the absence of definitive answers became itself the engine of fascination. For human beings are not content with mystery. They seek resolution, they demand clarity. Yet life and history often withhold such gifts. Dorothy, who had spent her career reminding others of that truth, became in death the embodiment of it. To some, she was a martyr to journalism, a woman who pursued the truth until it claimed her. To others, she was a tragic figure undone by her own burdens, her own solitude. To still others, she was a symbol, her death a warning of what befalls those who press too far into the secrets of power. Each interpretation reveals as much about the teller as it does about Dorothy herself. For in her silence, she became a mirror, reflecting the fears and suspicions of an age. Theories multiplied in later years. Some argued she had uncovered connections between Ruby and organized crime, links that reached into the very networks of American power. Others suggested she had learned of covert operations, of intelligence entanglements with Cuba, of plots that extended beyond any lone gunman. A few believed her notes contained direct testimony contradicting the Warren report, evidence that might have altered the nation's understanding of Dallas forever. Whether these claims were true, we cannot know. The missing pages left space enough for speculation to grow unchecked. Her story attracted seekers, authors, investigators, conspiracy hunters, each weaving their own fabric of suspicion. Some wrote with care, others with fervor, but all were drawn by the same magnet, the haunting possibility that Dorothy knew too much. Her name became a touchstone in discussions of the Kennedy case, invoked whenever the limits of the official account were questioned. She was remembered not only for what she wrote, but for what she never had the chance to publish. Yet even amid the swirl of suspicion, the woman herself remained. Dorothy was not merely a symbol, but a person, with children, with laughter, with weariness, with courage. To reduce her life to the circumstances of her death would be to overlook the fullness of her journey. And so, alongside the theories, there persisted the memory of her wit, her style, her fearless questioning, her sharpness on the panel of "What's my line?", her brilliance as a columnist. Even as legend grew around her, her humanity endured in the recollections of those who loved her. Perhaps that is the paradox of her legacy. The ambiguity of her death made her immortal in a way certainty never could. Had she died with clarity, by accident or by deliberate hand, proved beyond doubt, her story might have been closed, remembered but contained. Instead, the uncertainty left her story open, alive, continuing to provoke thought and debate half a century later. In this way, Dorothy remains present, her absence itself a form of presence, her silence a kind of voice. The candle flickers, though no wind is felt, its flame bending as though stirred by something unseen. It is in that flicker that we pause, for it leads us from the realm of speculation into the gentler realm of remembrance. Beyond theories and suspicions lies her enduring contribution, the legacy of her journalism, her courage, her style. It is to this legacy we now turn, to the echo of her pen and the persistence of her example, which outlived the mystery of her final night. The candle flickers though no wind is felt, its flame bending as though to remind us that even when shadows linger, light persists. And so it is with Dorothy Kilgallen's legacy. Beyond the mystery of her final night, beyond the missing papers and unanswered questions, there endures the truth of her life's work, the testament of her courage and craft. For to speak of Dorothy is not only to speak of theories and suspicion, but to recall the voice that carried through the pages of newspapers, across the airwaves of radio, and into the homes of millions through the glow of television. It is to remember the journalist who refused to be silenced in life, whose questions cut through the glitter of entertainment and the polish of politics alike. Her career stretched across decades when journalism itself was transforming, when women were often confined to the margins of the profession, asked to write of fashion, household tips, or gentle features. Dorothy broke through those confines with force, claiming her place among the most widely read columnists in the nation. Voice of Broadway was not merely a gossip column, but a tapestry of culture, a weaving of celebrity and politics, of wit and revelation that made her words sought after from coast to coast. Readers trusted her because she was sharp, but not cruel, probing, but not careless, able to see both the charm and the fragility of those she wrote about. Her presence on What's My Line remains part of her legend. There she embodied intelligence dressed in elegance, quick with a question, quicker still with an answer, her humor sparkling, her poise unshaken. For millions of viewers, she became a household name, admired for her wit as much as her style. She proved that knowledge and glamour need not be separate, that a woman could command both respect and affection, could outshine the very actors and public figures who sat across from her. To those who watched, she was both relatable and aspirational, a figure who seemed to carry grace lightly while never compromising her sharp mind. Yet it was her courage as an investigative journalist that secured her place in history. In pursuing the assassination of President Kennedy, she took risks few others dared. She sought interviews others considered impossible, sifted through contradictions others ignored, followed leads into shadows most preferred to leave untouched. Whether or not she uncovered the full truth, her willingness to pursue it, her refusal to settle for easy answers, became itself an act of defiance. She reminded her readers and her colleagues that journalism is not only about reporting what is given, but about questioning what is withheld. This courage carries meaning even now, long after her death. In a world where official narratives often press for acceptance, where power seeks to shape truth to its own ends, Dorothy's example endures as a reminder that the journalist's duty is to resist complacency, to ask again, to probe deeper, to trust the evidence of one's own eyes and ears, even when it contradicts the sanctioned account. Her pen, sharp as a blade, became the tool of such resistance, and in that resistance, she lives on. For women in journalism especially, Dorothy's path remains a beacon. She entered a world where few doors were open, and she forced those doors with her talent and persistence. She showed that a woman could not only hold her own among men, but surpass them, that she could command both authority and audience without surrendering her identity. Generations who followed, women who wrote fearlessly, who spoke boldly on air, who investigated with tenacity, walked in paths she helped clear. Even if they did not always name her, they carried forward the legacy she had carved. Her legacy also lies in the questions she left behind. For truth, as Dorothy knew, is not always revealed in answers, but in the persistence of questioning. By refusing to accept the official story of Dallas, she left behind a challenge not only to her contemporaries, but to all who came after. Will you accept what you are told, or will you look more closely? Will you be content with silence, or will you risk seeking what lies beneath? These questions echo through the decades, stirring doubt and reflection, unsettling the complacency of certainty. In remembering her, we also remember the humanity beneath the legacy. Dorothy was not only a journalist and a celebrity, but a woman of flesh and bone, with joys and sorrows, with triumphs and regrets. She carried the burdens of a troubled marriage, the loneliness of nights when even laughter could not soften the ache of solitude. She sought relief in drink, in company, in distraction, yet always returned to her desk, to her notes, to her purpose. In her resilience, we glimpse the depth of her character. In her weariness, we glimpse her vulnerability. To honor her fully is to acknowledge both. Her story, unfinished in death, continues to ripple outward. Books have been written about her, documentaries produced, scholars and seekers still tracing the lines she began. Each time her name is spoken, each time her work is revisited, she rises again from the silence that sought to contain her. And perhaps that is her greatest triumph, that even silenced, she still speaks, not through final answers, but through the questions she left. The scratch of her pen seems to continue even now, imagined by those who recall her as though she were still at her desk, still writing, still refusing to rest. That imagined sound leads us forward into the closing meditation of her story, where we return not to her death, but to her beginning, to the daughter of a newspaperman who pressed her ear against the typewriter keys and learned that words carry power enough to outlast silence. It is to that beginning and to the circle it completes that we now turn. The imagined scratching of her pen carries us backward, as though the sound itself were a thread, drawing us gently from the shadows of her final years to the brightness of her first days. The circle closes where it began, with a young girl leaning close to the typewriter of her father, listening to the rhythm of keys, striking paper, sensing even then that words were not only tools, but vessels of destiny. Dorothy May Kilgallen, born in 1913 to a newspaperman's household in New York, had her path shaped not by accident, but by the steady cadence of inquiry. She would carry that cadence through her life until her final night when silence took the place of words. In remembering her, we find ourselves moving between contrasts, light and shadow, laughter and sorrow, certainty and doubt. She was at once the glamorous panelist, beloved for her wit and elegance, and the relentless investigator, feared for her piercing questions. She was a mother who tucked her children into bed, and a solitary seeker who stayed awake long after midnight, scribbling notes by lamplight. She was celebrated in public, yet lonely in private. She was admired for her brilliance, yet burdened by secrets too heavy to share. To speak of Dorothy is to speak of duality, a life lived across boundaries, a life that could not be contained by a single mask. The stories she pursued live on in fragments. Some of her columns remain, shimmering with wit and insight. Recordings of "What's My Line?" still carry her voice, the laughter of the audience echoing as she poses a question or delivers a sly remark. In these relics, she is present still, vibrant, alive, untouched by the silence that later overtook her. Yet it is in the missing pages, the vanished notes, the work left unfinished, that her presence lingers most hauntingly. For absence is its own kind of presence, and Dorothy's absence calls to us like an unfinished line awaiting completion. Perhaps this is the true measure of her legacy, not the answers she gave, but the questions she left. She reminded us that truth is seldom simple, that appearances often conceal, that even the most official account may tremble beneath scrutiny. She reminded us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it, pen in hand, eyes unflinching. And she reminded us, finally, that silence does not erase a voice, that a story unfinished may echo longer than one neatly concluded. Her life was lived at a pace that left little room for rest. From the bustling newsrooms of her youth to the bright studios of radio and television, from the crowded nightclubs to the silent desk in her townhouse, Dorothy was always moving, always asking, always pressing further. She burned brightly, and like many who burn brightly, her flame was cut short. Yet the light she cast remains, reflected in the journalists who came after her, in the readers who still recall her columns, in the seekers who still pursue the questions she raised. Imagine her once more, a child in her father's house, pressing her ear close to the typewriter, hearing the steady music of truth being shaped into words. That sound became her inheritance, her guiding rhythm, her constant companion. Through triumph and loneliness, through applause and suspicion, through laughter and silence, she carried it with her. And though her own typewriter now rests still, though her voice is no longer heard, that rhythm endures in the questions she left behind. The circle closes, but not with finality, for Dorothy's story is unfinished, as all true stories are. It waits in the silence, in the missing pages, in the doubts that remain. It waits in the hearts of those who refuse to accept easy answers, who listen for the faint scratching of a pen in the night, who sense that truth may still be waiting just beyond the edge of certainty. And so, in remembering Dorothy Kilgallen, we do not close the book. We leave it open, its pages fluttering in the draft, its last line unwritten, inviting us to take up the pen she left behind. The typewriter rests silent, waiting. Its keys gleam faintly in the half-light, its platen ready for paper not yet fed into place. Perhaps one day another hand will strike those keys, will continue the story Dorothy began. Until then, we sit in the stillness, listening to the silence that speaks, feeling the presence of a journalist who knew too much and who dared to ask when others remained silent.